Hello, welcome. I'm going to introduce to you an author. I don't know whether you know of him. He's an Italian philosopher, very young, in his 30s, I think. His name is Diego Fusaro. I will put his name down in the description box. He has written already a lot of books, and I have read the Spanish translation from the Italian. I wasn't aware that it had been translated, and I was trying to read him in Italian and not very well. And then I found a translation. Then I went to, when I realized that I wanted to introduce him to you, for those of you who don't know him, I looked for the translations of his books into English, and I don't find them. I didn't spend a lot of time actually looking for them, just a few. I just went to the obvious places to see, but I couldn't see them. I see articles on his work, some of them by the University of Edinburgh and so on, but I can't actually find his books in English. But it doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just that I didn't spend a lot of time. But anyway, he wrote a book in Italian in 2017, and it might go by a different title. It's To Think Differently, or The Philosophy of Dissent, or Dissidence, or something like that. Okay, it's or The Philosophy of Dissent also, but in other languages it is translated as To Think Differently. Okay. The basis of this book is actually very, the importance is at the moment very current, actually, for what is happening in our societies. Okay. The basis of the book is to explain that we live in a society that for the most part has now managed to do away with real dissent or even dissidence, to the point of creating one sole way, one sole mode of thinking. Sometimes we call it groupthink, but it is the only one way that is allowed of thinking or judging politics, society, whatever. And which claims to reconcile, to bring together, to mix or to confuse the possible with the real. Well, that's a philosopher talking. What does he mean? Okay. First, in addition to being a philosopher, you see, he's an author of many books. He's also a polemicist. He has a regular presence in the traditional media on television and digital media too. And I have read this book, and I have also managed to find 2 or 3 interviews that he has done. Very interesting man. Anyway, he's not only a philosopher, but he's a sort of an intellectual. He's also very committed and very passionate about politics. And he's one who crosses boundaries here. Okay, so I'm going to have when I tell you what he says, a little bit read between the lines as usual. Okay, because I will not be able to use, very explicit words. He crosses boundaries, especially those boundaries of thought that are now considered. This you can only think in this way, and he goes way beyond that. And he criticizes, as you will see, both the left and the right. An acute opponent of the globalized economy, or globalism, of global financial power, and an opponent of neoliberal policies. He also poses hard questions to the new left, which he explains how it differs from the old left, okay, the left of old, and he sees this new left. He finds the left that they have forgotten, they have neglected that historic pulse of social conflict between those above and those below. They are now ignoring that vertical opposition between those at the top, the haves and the have-nots. He claims they have abandoned that, the new left. He goes well beyond that, says that they sold themselves to power, all kinds of things. He advocates getting out of that box and to dare, for all of us to dare to think differently. And to think differently is to accept the existence of different ways of thinking. Nothing new here, but we used to be able to oppose each other in politics and many other grounds, yes, and that seems to be no longer possible, although it is changing. The book was written in 2017. I think things have begun to change now, but to dare go against the grain, against groupthink. And that is what this particular work is about. And even though it is a little bit old, I think we can still learn quite a little bit from it. In this book, Thinking Differently, the book starts with a quote from Goethe, the German philosopher, quote, "No one is more of a slave than he who thinks himself to be free without being so." No one is more of a slave than he who thinks himself to be free without being so. So for him, the history of mankind is the history of dissent. I think he exaggerates here a little bit. We'll see what he says first. He says people have always rebelled. Those who are these rebels, those who express a different sentiment, a different view, the dissenters. Dissent comes from the word, he explains, dissentio, away, sentio, feeling, sentiment. And so they do so. They dissent to oppose and protest against always an established order, or simply against a common sentiment, a consensus, public opinion, that claims to be the only legitimate path and the only legitimate way to understand things. They have always been dissenters. And he goes back into history and explains Prometheus dissented against the gods, Socrates against unjust laws, Spartacus against slavery, and so on. And this has been a constant in human history, dissent from those who will just the dissenters are those who will just not go along with whatever is there accepted by everyone else. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse reasons, but they do not accept the word of those in power, and they have always been with us. In the words of Albert Camus, man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. Yes, everyone else in nature accepts their position. Dissent can take many forms, But he says, if we want to put it in just one way, he says it's best illustrated as saying no to power, saying no to power, to a given situation, to a symbolic order, and in the wanting and the yearning and wishing for an alternative situation. And so, because of this, those who will say no, we have, for good and bad, we have revolutions, we have rebellion, defection, protest, revolt, mutiny, antagonism, disagreement, insubordination, sedition, strikes, disobedience, resistance, sabotage, uprising, guerrilla wars, insurrection, agitation, boycotts. All those are forms of dissent, traditionally so, in the past. All words that have this one thing in common. These people feel different about the established order, about power, or about the dominant discourse. So the typical way of dissenting is to say no. But the act of dissenting is not just in rejection or opposition to something. On the contrary, the person is claiming actually that what he is in fact doing is doing more than rejecting something. They feel that he rejects something, yes, but in order to affirm something else, something different. In other words, he wants to dismantle something in order to rebuild something new. This could be in the extreme form of a revolution, but it doesn't mean that just I'm against it and nothing else. I'm against it because, and I want to do this instead, doing something new. Because rejection is just negative, but rebuilding or re-altering something could be positive. Yes, you reject something, but create an alternative or give the possibility of offer a different alternative. In other words, it has a certain life to it. It is not just killing something. Yeah, it's giving a new life to something. This is important because dissent, because we are going to compare dissent to consensus, to agreement, or assent instead of dissent. And as you see, consensus can be approval, yes, but it can also mean just mere acceptance, something that is there, something that has entered public opinion, and it's there in the air, public opinion, and you don't know why or you don't care, but it is there in the air. We are going to see how things actually, a little bit later on, how things actually enter into this air of public opinion, mainly through the media. But people accept it many times without thinking about it. And so, in this sense, consensus has the approval of people, but it's almost it has almost an meaningless meaning, an inert meaning, like a corpse. It has no life. You have just accepted it. Dissent, on the other hand, is always active, he says. It's either affirming or negating something, but it is alive, it is active. For Erich Fromm, philosopher, the founding myths of Western culture are based on the act of dissent or disobedience, he says. And it is the beginning of human culture. I don't necessarily agree with this. Both disobedience and obedience, you can find examples. Abraham obeyed. Yeah, Prometheus disobeyed the gods. Yes, Adam and Eve disobeyed, but anyway, I don't think that I don't want to go into that, because I think obedience and disobedience differ from consensus and dissent, in that obedience and disobedience has a more moral tone to it, but I don't want to go into that. This is what basically the point that he's making is that actually it is that going against the grain that always produces a new advancing culture, as it were. Now, dissent as rejection of authority and power, real or symbolic, constitute, he claims, this original gesture, this original, it's the beginning of things, of changing things. And that is why power throughout history, in all epochs of history, and in all its different configurations, power at the top always tries, sometimes openly, sometimes less openly, but always tries to suppress it. Or, even further, repress it. Or, further still, ban it. Depending on the epoch, yes? Throughout the whole of history. Now, Fusaro claims that what is different now, and I'm not saying this is new, it's not new. I mean, the English have been doing this for centuries, elsewhere especially, but what we can all see now with open eyes is that they are power with a capital P. Okay, preventing it from appearing, dissent, preventing dissent from appearing, from surging, from even being born, he says. They are there well before you see the contradictions. They aware of the contradictions and therefore managing things so that you don't even come to the possibility of dissent, of disagreement. What is all this about? Okay. Now, why is or should be dissent such a problem in a democracy, in a democratic society? We can understand that it is a problem under a tyrannical government, yeah, but in a democracy, why? Dissent should be a good thing in a democratic society, no? Because democracy is a system of government where people are free, in theory anyway, we're free to agree and to disagree, right, with each other. So you and your friends disagree on something, your neighbor and his friends disagree with you, or agree with you, and at the end, the best thing is there is a context, and this group wins and the other one loses, and so on. Okay, so when there has been disagreement and this group has won the argument, their right to govern is actually strengthened, isn't it? It has more power because it was put before the public, and whatever they believe, their stand won. So the fact that people are able to disagree, some people were able to disagree and nevertheless were defeated, that's fine. But so dissent actually gives democracy strength, is its strength. It's not a sign of weakness. Not only dissent accepts democracy should not just see dissent as trying to repress it, but actually should find in dissent its strength, not its weakness. Yes, I know that all this is talking about theory here, but we have to kind of start with the theory before we attack the practice, as it were. Okay, what is supposed to be and to mean before we attack its how it is actually practiced. So in democratic societies right now, why is dissent, one might argue, why is dissent seen as the enemy of democratic power, as the enemy of a government in power, for example? Because, as I said, the objective of democracy is not the objective. What makes a democracy actually is not a society without opposition. That would be a tyranny. A democratic government needs dissident voices. It does. It actually gives it legitimacy. Dissent does. They know that. And we're going to see how this legitimacy is going to be artificially created while dissent is put down. Democratic governments should not refuse to abide by it, should not oppose it. When dissidence is silence, this author says, Fusaro says, when dissidence is silenced, democracy should be alarmed. Besides, why should consensus always be understood as being an inherent necessary feature of the democratic process? What do I mean? More is needed in a democratic society, more than consensus. It is not enough. That is not enough to form a democracy. Not just consensus, because a cruel dictatorship also has consensus, apparent, but it does have it, but never, this is the difference, never tolerates dissidence. Our actual democratic systems appear at the moment less and less democratic. Some people argue so. Why? Okay, Fusaro argues three main points. He says, point number one, why do we see it less and less democratic? First, he says the emptying out of people's own sovereignty. Power at the moment resides globally, but people prefer their nation's sovereignty, not the global one, and account it, for not elected, and so on. You know the arguments. But people, for the most part, he claims, want their own nation states' sovereignty, where their politicians can be accountable to them, to the people, not a situation where their politicians are accountable to supranational global powers. People feel disenfranchised. So that is point number one, that people feel that their government is becoming less democratic. Number one. Number two, they feel that it's becoming less and less democratic because of a growing social inequality, certainly in economic terms. This is a fact, actually. There have always been differences, but I heard some tremendous statistics about, for example, how billionaires actually doubled or tripled their wealth during the 2020 illness. And there are many places where you can find this information, but the first one that I noticed was one statistics by a little thing written by the charity Oxfam. I am in Oxford, and Oxfam actually was born here in Oxford in the 1930s or 40s, something like that. But so what they say is, I'll read it to you, just a little blur. They say, the 10 richest men doubled their fortunes. This is an article, a little tiny article published on the 17th of January 2022. So only 2 years after the whole thing started. Yeah. So this is the headline: 10 richest men doubled their fortunes in pandemic, while incomes of 99% of humanity fail. A new billionaire minted every 26 hours. And a little blurb here: the world's 10 richest men more than doubled their fortunes from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion at a rate of $15,000 per second, or $1.3 billion a day, during the first 2 years of a pandemic that has seen the incomes of 99% of humanity fall, and over 160 million more people forced into poverty. In quotes, if these 10 men were to lose 99.999% of their wealth tomorrow, they could still be richer than 99% of all the people on this planet, said Oxfam International's executive director Gabriela Booker. They now have 6 times more wealth than the poorest 3.1 billion people. Anyway, this is from Oxfam, but it is a fact, isn't it, that during, from 2020, so many small businesses had to close, but the big ones, Amazon and all those, were open, and obviously people went to them. So that's number 2. Number 1 was the sovereignty issue, that politicians, we don't feel that they are accountable to us anymore. The second was social inequality. And the third, Fusaro says, is a general atrophy when it comes to dissidence, as if somehow not enough space, as if somehow there is no longer enough space to move about for opposing thoughts. We are more constrained. This constraint, he calls it atrophy. what I'm doing now, a kind of, a bit, as I said at the beginning, we YouTube creators, sort of having to walk on eggshells most of the time, a little bit, many reasons, and it's not only logarithms. Okay, so there is this closing in, somehow, we don't know quite, but not feeling free enough to express ourselves as we want to express ourselves. So, okay, so those are his main 3 points. Now let us go back to consensus. More and more, we are being manipulated into this consensus. That is his point. You say, oh, come on. All right, so you don't believe it, you don't believe it. Okay. Continue, please, if you like, to think that everything you believe about governments and society and wars and the like, it's all your own thoughts. And you alone are not influenced by what you hear. If that is what you want to believe, fine. To me, that alone would prove that you are being manipulated. But in any case, you're free to do what you want. But let's move on. Why would they, you can ask, why would they, power, there, capital P, why would they manipulate you? Why would they care to manipulate the masses? Well, they could say, why not? They would answer, sarcastically perhaps. Can you see, in order to build a consensus, or they could answer, because we can, just like Bill Clinton. Why did you do this with this girl and the other girl? Because I could. Okay, so in order to build a consensus, that is what they want. But what they want is a consensus that is passive. You don't realize it, yeah? So the war, the current war, is because of this and that continually, yeah? Okay, they give you the reasons, okay. And you have no thoughts on that, okay. And I accept, or you accept, that that is what they're telling me is the truth, fine, okay. And eventually it creates a consensus. You don't have the time, or you don't care to challenge that, you just accept it. That is consensus. But it's not, it's conformity. We'll get to that. Fusaro says that is consensus, but it's passive. It's a passive consent, passive consensus. And because of this passive consensus, can't you see, your ability for dissidence, for dissent, has been weakened. If you don't know why, if you have just accepted it, how on earth are you going to challenge it? If you accept it because you have looked into it and said, oh, you're right, then you make the choice not to question it because you agree with it. But if you have just accepted it, obviously dissent, he says, has been weakened in the population. And boy, do we see a difference since 1989, and especially since 2003. You remember the Iraq War. People were still able to demonstrate en masse about the Iraq War. Well, they saw that. They said, this can no longer be. Have to find a way to do away with this open dissent. One philosophical point here. Hobbes, the great English philosopher, in Leviathan, said that even the state's absolute power could not enter into a person's conscience, therefore could not control it. That's no longer the case. Things have changed. Psychology, amongst many other things, came to the aid of power with a capital P, like so many other disciplines, yeah? It started out psychology, for example, started out trying to help the individual to know himself. We Catholics had Catholic confession, but anyway, many didn't. So they needed the equivalent. So here we have Freud, who is considered the father of psychology as a discipline, not of psychological understanding. I mean, Dostoevsky comes well before that, and many others, okay? But as a discipline of study, Freud seems to be one of the early fathers, came to the rescue. And so, well, this is beside the point I'm making, but we now know that Freud was actually protected. Many people now see that he was actually protecting a certain class of people with, let's say, irregular sexual desires concerning the young and so on. And so he was telling them, well, in any case, that's besides the point. But my point is that psychology, which we have always understood to help the individual, you could say the same about medicine, has actually turned against the individual and came together to help power. Psychology later came to study, in other words, how to influence people. Freud's nephew, as a matter of fact, started the advertising industry in the United States, telling them how to manipulate the minds. Yes, with just simple advertising. It may seem now a little bit of a joke because they have learned a lot since then, and we are no longer influenced in the same way. But the core is and was how to influence you, different ways in different times, but eventually how to influence you, how to persuade you. And if you don't notice, the better, the more efficacious, the more efficient this manipulation of the mind has been. Today, government control has reached certainly an individual's conscience by many techniques. And this is part of Fusaro's thesis. Let's see, what happens is this. Power has learned that it doesn't have to wait until the moment you want to dissent from their narrative, and then after you dissent, and then repress your thoughts, or arrest you, or torture you, or kill you, as in the past. That's old school. They don't need to do that in this society. We've become more sophisticated, wouldn't you know? There is more finesse here. Simply put, actions have been taken, and plans put into actions have been taken beforehand to prevent you even from getting to that stage of dissent or even doubt. That is, for dissent being established in your mind, for you to even think that there is something wrong or something to complain about what you are hearing. But that's the point, that actions and plans were put into effect for those doubts to even be born, not to even be born in the first place in your mind. It is not really open repression and torture. These are not resorted to, not really, because they are not needed. Not really. Why no longer these excesses on how to treat dissent? Why are they no longer necessary? Because our leaders are, okay, you could say, someone could say, are our leaders better human beings? They're not necessary because the leaders, are more intelligent, more civilized, more sophisticated. In part so, but not necessarily. It is because they have preempted your dissent, because they've done their homework beforehand. I will never, in other words, I will never get to the point of, when I say I, okay, they will never get to the point of imprisoning you, because you will never even get to the point of doubting what they're telling you. The work, I don't mean you specifically, I know, but a great majority of people are in that situation. The work has been done beforehand. And if you're not alert, you're not alert. Nothing wrong with you, you're just not alert. And looking at the world, you're not looking at the world with open eyes. Perhaps you prefer it that way. Fine. But me, I would rather see what's coming to hit me rather than being hit from behind, as it were. I really prefer to know. In any case, they preempted dissidence and dissent from even getting into your mind. And so there are, at the moment, there are not very many, no real dissenting minds. And in the absence of dissenting minds and rebellious spirits, repression and all that other stuff is no longer necessary. Why punish you for doubting if you have never even thought of the possibility that there is such a thing as doubt? You had to put it in an extreme way. In the 21st century, power, that power with a capital P, Fusaro says, no longer punishes bodies. It just simply takes over minds instead. It captures souls. And all that multipluralism and multiculturalism, multi-whatever, okay? So many voices, so many ideas apparently, all that multi-everything, all that comes to nothing, because they are all saying ultimately the same thing in the end. It is not really the dialogue of many, but the monologue of the few. Multiplurality is fictitious, he says, whether in the field of ideas or whether you're talking about political parties or whatever, what have you. It doesn't matter which political party therefore wins, in the case of politics, this one or that one, because the result is going to be the same. Now, one thing, John Stuart Mill, in the 19th century, we know him, his father was with Jeremy Bentham, one of the utilitarians, philosophy. John Stuart Mill came to write very many important books and essays on liberty and so on. Okay, so it's someone that we have to study in certainly philosophy, political philosophy. And he spoke, and this is in the 19th century, he spoke of a, in quotes, despotism of custom. Despotism of custom, he called it. He was referring to, I'm going to, all right, okay. Despotism of custom, a sort of a general conformity, conformism. But in his era, what he was addressing was this. Okay, he was saying that he was against everyone thinking and feeling the same way. He considered that a sort of there was a tyrannical weight of the majority against those who wanted to be different. This is what we call classical liberalism. In other words, in a society where everybody was, homogeneous, everybody, community, everyone shared the same morals, the same. Okay. And he was, as a classical liberal, trying to say, hey, why not allow each individual to be different? He was absolutely right. Yeah. Why not allow giving power to the individual? And so you have, for example, at the end of the century, you have Oscar Wilde with his blue carnation, dandyism started. And if you want purple hair, why not? Why shouldn't someone have purple hair? Doesn't offend anyone. So he was fighting for the individual against this weight of the majority, when everything in a homogeneous society where everybody, he felt, thought the same, did the same, spoke in the same way. So he's vouching for the individual, for the liberty of that individual. That is John Stuart Mill. But you see, the thing today is very different, and I'm coming to that. Because he was talking about a certain kind of conformity of the population. He was actually addressing, in his writings, he's addressing the mediocrity, he called it, of public opinion. He was a good classical liberal, but he wasn't talking about what we today call conformism. Let me first of all tell you exactly. I went to the Britannica, but about John Stuart Mill. But what comes first is this AI. So I tried it, and it says John Stuart Mill, 1806-1873, believed that the despotism of custom, which is what I'm going to talk about, the despotism of custom was a hindrance to human progress and a threat to self-expression. He believed that conformity to custom prevented people from learning from each other and developing their own unique qualities. Mill thought that a liberal society should tolerate a diversity of lifestyles and encourage experiments in living, in quotes. Okay, so you see what he is attacking. He says conformity is social tyranny. Mill believed that the social majority could use social penalties to force people to conform to custom. They did. You would be ostracized very, very quickly. So, in other words, conform. Yeah? We're talking about that 19th century society. It's not what we have today. I'll come to that. You can understand what he's saying. more freedom for individual expression. Yeah, he says individuality is essential. Mill believed that people should develop their own minds, feelings, and imagination to become independent thinkers. We agree. Liberty is the only source of improvement, he says. Mill believed that liberty was the only way to ensure that there were many independent centers of improvement. Avoiding forcing your opinions on others. Mill believed that people should only force their opinions on others if they were certain of their truth. A lot to discuss here, but in any case, all right. To embrace diversity. Mill believed that diversity allowed people to learn from each other and combined positive traits. Mill was a philosopher, a liberal MP, and civil servant who is considered to have contributed more to liberalism than any other theorist. And with regards to what I quoted, the despotism of custom, Mill warns us against the mediocrity of public opinion. Okay, so here was a person who was vouching for the individual against this amorphous class of people. Fine. But that is not what we're talking about today. Because conformism now is not the same as conformity then. It is actually the opposite. Perhaps we should find another word for it. Involuntary subjugation. No, that's too long. Okay, so I don't agree here with Diego Fusaro using Mill in this context, because it's not the same situation. We're not talking about the same things. For Mill, he was arguing about allowing individual people to be different. Yes. Your lifestyle different. Yes. Your blue carnation. Yes. Your purple hair. Yes. But this is the opposite. Our situation now is the opposite. Our situation now is that everyone is different. The opposite. And those differences are imposed on the rest of society. The differences of some are imposed on the rest. It's a total inversion. Worse than that, it is government or power that is also imposing that one thought, one sole thought group think. Not the community anymore. There is no community. It's that minority or the power with a capital P itself. How dare you think differently? We're telling you that this war is about this and this and this. Just accept it. Yeah? So that was Mill's despotism of custom. Another philosopher, German, Hegel, called that the equality of irrelevance. It's for all the liberals, okay? Because in those communities they all felt and they all feel and think and want the same things. So that conformity was mediocrity for both of those two philosophers. But as I said, the pendulum has swung in the other direction. We're talking about a different kind of conformity now. We're now talking about conformism, when it actually comes from power to tell you, don't even think about thinking differently, or you will be cancelled. The list of it. Why? Why is this society so different? Because humanity is divided now into a multitude of equal atoms, individuals, qualitative the same, without identity or even personality. A man without personality becomes the new individual in this society. Here is what I mean. Man is alone, not connected to community. A malleable, a pliable human being without real identity, without real personality, without family, without oppositional consciousness, uprooted, without many times without stable work, reduced to the rank of being a consumer atom, an individual atom, a nomadic atom, and what is worse, incapable of understanding the exploitation that he suffers. A homo inestabilis, Fusaro calls him. There is no ethical, familial, work or nation stability. A multitude of qualitatively equal and interchangeable beings, each thinking himself, entertaining himself, thinking of himself, his own interests, indifferent for the most part to the fate of the rest of the community, certainly not touched by it to any great extent, without that link and that identity that comes from a shared tradition, without critical force, without cultural depth, and from above, from that P, power with capital P, almost unnoticed, almost imperceptibly, a permissive soft power that keeps people in a stage of infancy and immaturity, offering permanent entertainment and relieving them from the effort of thinking critically. The reason for dissent inevitably implies a reaction to something, a consensus that has been perceived as unjust. In the current mass democracy of our society of consumption or consumerism, power has managed to neutralize the building up of dissidence by creating an ever-present, all-pervasive consensus through a functional, practical, massive conformism. The system allows you to do whatever you want without any limits, but always up to a point, always as long as there is total agreement about certain given parameters. What parameters? Imposed by who exactly? Well, they have agents, obviously. Let's see. The media, the new clergy, the journalistic clergy, the intellectual class, academia, etc., imposing a new orthodoxy. An orthodoxy is almost like a new religion, it's an ideology, but it's like a new monotheistic religion. It's an orthodoxy no longer in need of burnings at the stake, you understand, because it is no longer necessary to persecute rebels. How so? Because none remain. No rebels left. That's the goal. Fusaro says that to understand the beginning of this conformism, we have to go back certainly to 1989, the disappearance of a political alternative that had certainly not succeeded in giving freedom to millions of slaves in the communist system. He comes from a Marxist tradition of thought, it is evident, but in any case, before then, before 1989 at any rate, there was a division between two visions of the world, each of them actually showing the contradictions of the other. It was a scenario, he says, offering the possibility to many countries of alternative perspectives. But the inglorious, I'm quoting him, but the inglorious fall of historical communism marked the triumph of the unlimited expansion of techno-capitalism, and then the march of international capital began, the reconfiguration of the traditional class struggle, the haves and the have-nots in each individual country, and these led to the extinction of the traditional class struggle. Okay, what are we talking about here? What we now have is not the traditional class struggle of old, but a rebellion of the elite instead. Not of the poor. What occurred was a rebellion of the elite, where the masters recovered everything the serfs had achieved through democratic political organization and struggle. They took it back. And a new aristocracy was formed. Not national this time, obviously. We were all aware of the ruling class, the working class in our own nation. No longer that. I have talked about this many times. No longer national, but transnational, above national. A financial aristocracy. Workers left without resources and without class conscience. The end of history, Fukuyama's end of history, and the end of ideologies. That was the new world. No more ideologies. Everything, the whole world, will be a liberal democracy. So no more ideologies except the one ideology, our ideology, the sole neoliberal, neofeudal, Fusaro says, elite. Only that thought that blesses the existing order and which paradoxically brands as ideological any dissident vision contrary to that one-dimensional thought, using a word coined by Herbert Marcuse, who's one of the main political philosophers from the left in the 60s, the one neoliberal, one-dimensional way of thinking. And that is presented almost as a natural and an eternal vision, having done away with all the others, religion, for example, that was an history, for example, sense of community and shared memories, for example, and becoming or presenting itself as the new eternal destiny. And questioning what is, or whether things could be different, that alone becomes dissent. The system is what it is, and admits of no dissent, no doubts. This atom, this last man now, says Fusaro, suffers in silence, devoid of hope, devoid of passion, thinking that it is his fault. He no longer, because he's alone, isolated atom, he no longer aspires to even overthrow the order that may dominate him or may exploit him, the order that may oppress him. Why? Why not? Because he can't. He no longer knows that something is oppressing him. His social rights of old, that, thing of old, all those rights, they're now suppressed. But he didn't even notice when the whole thing started. Gradually, step at a time, slow but continual action, turning what until yesterday were rights and privileges and presenting their inversion as acceptable, that he no longer has them. That is the acceptable thing now. And how did power do that? Because it manages the flow of consensus and dissent. Sometimes they create the dissent themselves. People may sometimes call it different names, false flag and controlled opposition. Okay. This is power itself creating its own dissent. Why? Let's see. In many cases, it will try itself, power, to generate dissent themselves. Not you, they, power, generate dissent themselves. A dissent that they can control, always, of course, in relation to issues, for example, such as public spending, labor rights, taxes, right to strike, so that later, when they come to, for example, privatization, they have already formed a consolidated consensus. So they're going to create the dissent, and then it's like coming to a new synthesis there. The same with dissent on views on wars, for example. Power is in charge and control of this one sole mode of thinking, this one-dimensional thought, this thinking. The world is as it is. And we are telling you that this war is about this or that, and not about that or this. And this is the truth, and this is how things are. And you cannot change this consensus. You cannot change the world. You are powerless. And this, with the sole purpose, they do all this, and the sole purpose is preventing it being changed. This is self-fulfilling prophecy. And the old notion of people questioning themselves, or the government, what happened to that? But power has managed to convince you that things are as you are told they are. And therefore, the ability to think about other possibilities or plan future alternatives, that is gone. It can loosen its control over bodies, says the author, because It already possesses dominion over their minds. We live in a society made up of isolated individuals, unable to fight individually, stripped of traditional old narratives, shared histories, shared memories, within a framework of within a framework of this atomistic individualism, alienated, separated from others. An individualism that has cut off all interlinks of communication with others, even though through technology we are always in touch. I remember when TV became I remember when television became popular. I remember when radio all right. I remember those huge radios where you had to turn the dial. Do you remember those? You had to turn the dial and anyway. Okay, but when it became popular really in the 60s, do you remember that? Probably not. Okay, but people would no longer gather. It was a major change because people would no longer gather at the kitchen table to talk. They sat in front of the television to watch something together. Looking back, it was actually still pretty good because families watched together. But the criticism at the time, if you remember, is that, and it was vividly expressed, was that people no longer talk to each other. That was the criticism then. Now, again, and even more so, we're all connected, but all community ties are gone. We are alone. We have been nudged ever so gradually, ever so carefully, to be alone. A triumph of individuality coexisting at the same time with a massive hermit-like population. Each one a Robinson Crusoe, lonely, isolated, incapable of communicating real communication, and yet under the illusion of being free while living in this realm of an inauthentic existence that is isolation. Loneliness for many, acting and behaving as everyone acts and behaves, and thinking as everyone else thinks, perhaps wanting some communion with them in some way. And power manages the webs and flows of dissent. It exploits them to strengthen the structures of its own power. It must appear that dissent is possible. It awakens the illusion that questioning the system is possible, but all the while is hiding the fact that it is the system itself, the one who is putting dissent out there. It manages it. It administers it. It regulates it. Yes, it regulates dissent. I said before, you've heard of false flags, yeah? That comes from the pirates' days. You know, you had the pirates and they would put the flag of some other nation or some other country, yeah? It was false. They were pirates. But anyway, it comes from there, I think. But you heard of that. You heard of what young people nowadays call gaslighting, which I kind of understand what it means, deceiving you, but I don't know the connection between gaslighting and deception. I don't quite understand it, but that is the expression that they use. You probably know why. And you heard of controlled opposition, obviously. So heard of those who, appearing to dissent, are actually sometimes unknowingly, not always aware themselves, that they actually are pawns of power with a capital B, P. People were surprised, lots of people on the right, let's call it that. You remember, okay, this is the situation I want to put to you, to say that a lot of people were surprised when they saw it, because lots of people on the right say, in the last, let's say, 6 years, when this woke ideology came along, a lot of people on the right fought against it. Most emphatically, they were against it. Against that, against, no longer talks about it now, but political correctness, you remember? A lot of people against that. A lot of people against all manner of wokish things, you remember? Against the established narrative. Against the establishment they appear to be. Okay, so you had all these people from the right, people said, going against all this new wave of new things, new woke ideology. You remember that, right? And then, all of a sudden, lo and behold, they're all in favor of the establishment. How? They're all in favor of wars who favor the establishment, so they are in favor of the establishment, after all, of power. And, both wars, or the 3 wars, or I don't know how many wars do we have at the moment, 3, 4, I don't know, 3 of them, certainly. And they are, these people who used to criticize the wokes, now they are in favor of the establishment. They are in favor of power. That means that they were never truly against the establishment. Some knew that they were in favor and that they were playing a role, intelligence, whatever, okay? False opposition. But others didn't. Others truly believed that they were fighting the system. They thought they were fighting it, but in fact they were pawns. More about this in a minute. So many who dissent may believe themselves that they are exercising their freedom to dissent, undoubtedly, but that dissent, or how far you are allowed to go in your dissent, that is managed and controlled, and you have no control over it. It's controlled not by you. You have been allowed to dissent up to this point and no further. Appearance that dissent is allowed, actual dissidence, actual dissent beyond the point is not. So we're going back to conformism now. You are to conform. We, power, are in control. The masses are no longer a multitude, a crowd. Rather, it is this amorphous quantity of individual selves that see and consume and think the same things, now in a solitary manner. massification and individualism together, hand in hand. And in this atomized mass society, it sounds like a contradiction. This atomized mass society, one calculates, but one does not truly dissent. We purchase and consume things, but critical awareness is not very often acquired. We dissent as the hegemonic dominant power wants us to dissent, allows us to dissent, a controlled dissent that does not really question overall ultimate power. Rather, it accepts it and confirms it. If you disagree about the economy, fiscal policies, if you go too far, you could even be branded a communist. On social issues, immigration, whatever, if you go too far, you could be accused of many things. In other words, against human rights, for example. Or of all, you can think of all the phobias attached to whatever name, whatever group. So a new monotheistic religion is in town now. One must disavow all others to transform the world into this tabula rasa, this clean slate, this mind, this smooth surface, where goods and financial flows circulate without any opposition. Diego Fusaro says that consensus and conformism are secured right now. Secured, he says, but hidden behind a proliferation, a growth of sterile differences, deceptive, I'm quoting, deceptive dichotomies that continuously divert dissent, real one, in other directions, not against the core of the system, the class character of this new corporate capitalism, this power. The divisions are now misleading. The divisions in society. We used to talk about the right and the left. We knew what it was. Yes, the right, traditional, was for the rich. The left, revolutionary, was in favor of the poor. Pretty straightforward. That is how it was. We understood it with all these different things. But we all see with our own eyes that has changed. The left is now, certainly parties on the left are now the friends of corporate power. Look at the Democrats in America, among others. Look at the Green Party in Germany. They call them olive green because they're all for war. They used to be on the left. The left was anti-war. So we are seeing these differences. What happened? And at the same time, we see that the workers who were traditionally on the left have turned to the right. Why? Because they are rich? No. Because the left became the friend of corporations, and the workers had to go somewhere else to find someone to speak up for them. Because since the left became a friend of corporate power, it is obviously in favor of transnational finance, which means that it has to be against, therefore, sovereignty in this dichotomy of globalism versus national sovereignty. The poor, traditionally of the left, moving now to the right because the right defends, in a few cases, not always by any means, but tends to defend more national sovereignty, albeit for different reasons though. So people say everything has changed. There has been a sort of a turnaround in the political parties. Not quite. Let me drink a little bit of coffee. I feel as if I'm preaching a sermon, but not quite. Things have been thrown into the midst there. There is a lot of fog, there is a lot of sand. Ooh, men versus women, old versus young, native population versus foreigners, immigration, atheist versus believers, homosexuals versus heterosexuals, vegetarians versus carnivorous. Need I go on? Okay, so these divisions were artificially fostered and encouraged. In other words, don't look at big power over there above. Fight amongst your own little selves there. The objective? Twofold. First, hide the contrast between those above and those below. That's number one. Hide the contrast and the differences between those above and those below. Second, prevent that all those multiple conflicts and mini dissents and micro fights between different identities, which are many, prevent that all those coalesce into one powerful uniform dissent. That would be the rejection of the system. So keep them fighting amongst themselves. Never look up. The struggle, instead of being vertical, horizontal. Fight amongst yourselves. And they keep, creating more and more differences. So the economic class struggle turned into an identity fight. The economic struggle went against the system directly. But the fight between men and women, homosexuals and heterosexuals, natives or immigrants, don't even touch that. That's not the system itself. And in all these micro struggles, mini struggles and identity fights, you see, what is happening is that we are, like two hens pecking at each other while they're both taken to the boiling pot to make chicken soup. And they're both taken there, and all they do is to peck each other. That's what we are doing. So the original class struggle is now degraded and confused among a long list of many other micro conflicts. So no authentic opposition is possible because they're all fighting each other. Traditionally, in the classic class struggle, let's say an unemployed gay person had more in common with an unemployed straight person than with a multimillionaire gay person CEO with 3 yachts. Not anymore, because the community, people were in community, and the identity was not, it was the economic class that you belonged to. Not anymore that. Now it could be, I'm using the gays as an example, is the first thing that occurs to me, but an unemployed gay will probably identify with the gay CEO earning $1 trillion more than with an unemployed heterosexual man. And so with other identities. The enemy now is always the other individual, never the overall dominant economic system. Power, with a big P, has managed to convince the minds of people that their enemy is the one who is in the same condition as he is, or even those below him, never those above. The individual is never invited to look above, to look up. So any rejection of the system remains dispersed and fragmented into 1,000 fights, secondary oppositions that divert attention from the main contradiction. And in this way, what they have done is to very effectively pulverize class consciousness or national consciousness, preventing the formation of a unified front, Diego Fusaro says, a unified front of the offended, of the stolen from, of the humiliated by that transnational oligarchy. And so you see, what we end up with is that young anti-fascist youth, in absence of real fascism, confront young anti-communist youth in the absence of communism. While capital, the kings of finance, and the masters of globalization continue to advance with their policies without much resistance. At least until yesterday. And who benefits from this permanent division in society? And how avoid the anger of being trapped? Well, you see, the classical vertical struggle, that of classical times, that of master versus slave, master-slave, vertical, has been replaced for a horizontal one, the struggle between slaves themselves. I'm not trying to say that we are slaves. I'm using the same sort of figure of speech. The fight is horizontal. Keep the fight here below amongst themselves, amongst yourselves. And what happened to that old division between left and right that we know has changed? Yes, because before they were clearly different. Well, now that's no longer so clear-cut. You see, the position of power is now this. Oligarchic power is both, they themselves are both on the right and on the left and even in the middle, creating dissent there wherever it is necessary. Yes. On the economy, power is on the right. Let's call it for short, money right. Okay? On the economy is on the right. Let's call it money right. The money right. All right. In politics, it is in the center. Consensus. Let's call it consensus center. In culture, new culture and social issues, power is on the left. Let's call it the new culture left. Money right, consensus center, new culture left. They're there. We could call it, instead of culture, we could call it custom, as John Stuart Mill did, but we can't, because we are now talking about different cultural and social issues. We are talking about new ones that have been introduced and innovated. So, new culture left. Okay, so they are in power in the left and in the right and in the center, transmitting two or three, actually two visions of the world. I say two and not three, the center, because the center will lean this way or that way, to the right or to the left, according to different circumstances and criteria. So two visions of the world at the same time. And they use those divisions and they create them. If you can imagine, neoliberalism, or this power, is a two-headed eagle. Okay? That is the power. Two heads. Look, on money, power is on the right, as I said. On culture, it is on the left. Fine. Culture is now innovative. Sorry, I can't remember. Okay. It is not the custom, the traditional customs of old. These new ones have been fostered on the idea not of holding the community together, these new cultural, social issues, but built upon individual enjoyment, individualism, relativism, consumption, in short, a lifestyle necessary to reproduce financial profits. That's the money right. The money right needs the consumer atom stripped of utopian illusions and passions. They want one who does not believe in anything except the here and now. While the new culture left, at the same time, exalts that poor, isolated individual who realizes himself in a narcissistic way, enjoyment and fun without inhibitions or shame, freedom misunderstood as his own individual thing. So they work together, the money right, consumer, I want you, the money left, exalting that individual and his narcissism. In tandem. The money right, with labor deregulation, provides a worker throughout his entire life with what you might say rather precarious wages, preventing him from forming a family, which was always supposed to be a good thing, or buying a house. That's the money right. Well, it's little helper here. The money left, not the money left, the new culture left helps along by justifying the legitimization of the family as a reactionary, obsolete institution, and actually even going as far as glorifying some rather precarious ways of living as lifestyles. Homelessness is not a lifestyle. It wasn't meant to be so. But there is a glorification of certain aspects of living that people have got there because of circumstances, And now this thing, they're trying to get this thing out of it and call it lifestyles. For the money right, national nation states no longer have any meaning because they are globalists, yeah? They're trying to get the meaning out of it little by little. Well, their little helper, the new culture left, praises globalization, praises mass immigration, praises a false multiculturalism, praises the destruction of a common tradition. If the money right says that society, meaning a community, a nation, does not exist or shouldn't exist, the new culture left helps along by delegitimizing all forms of community, narcissistically praising the individual. If the money right aspires to have, to a lower humanity, bring humanity to a dust of precarious loners without personality or cultural depth, bring them down. The new culture left will help along by delegitimizing the very idea of such thing as human nature. No such thing. They said you can turn into whatever you want. So you see, here is power right, okay, here it is, and the role of the left or the new culture of beliefs. What it really does is what this left does is to administer, to manage dissent. This is the money right here, this is what it is, this is what we want, this is how it will be. And it is the little left that manages to administer and make sure it happens. To manage that dissent. Dissent against what? Against anything that might limit or fight against that power of the money right. Both work together, birds of a feather. And just to end, a very quick word about this new intellectual class, that new journalism clergy, that new media circus. A new clergy, indeed, in this new secular but monotheistic ideology, which functions as a religion. That journalist clergy who believes in nothing and preaches on everything, glorifying the markets with disdain for the obvious disdain for the losers, as if a human life was all about money, obvious disdain for the losers, obsequiousness for the winners. They are the loudspeakers of the existing system, administrators, managers of consensus, whose job is to ensure and strengthen massive conformism among the population. That's their role. Their maximum desire to suppress alternative means, alternative thought, alternative forms of dissent, to protect that one-way thinking, one-dimensional way of thinking, ideology, to promote uniformity, conformity, conformism. And by doing so, actually inverted, turned the idea of freedom upside down. Because freedom is now, ladies and gentlemen, total submission to power. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.